Hello, my name is Taylor Stein. I'm a professor in the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. My background and what I specialize in here at the school is understanding how to manage and plan for recreation and ecotourism on conserved and protected lands. So what I have focused my research on over the last few decades since I was a young master's student is on the people part of things. So I consider myself a social science researcher, which is why I'm here. So I know most of you might not go off to go be recreation managers. If you're working on public lands, you probably will be. But as natural resource managers, you generally will be working with resources that are important to the public. So that's why I am here to basically give you a clue on the social science methods that might be available to you. So for this topic, we're just going to basically introduce the idea of social science research. I got this profane title here to hopefully get your interest, but really the secondary title down there, why does this matter to natural resource managers, is what we'll be going for today. So I try to keep this lecture short, but again, social science research is entire majors for people, so just introducing it could take forever. However, for today, what I'll be going over is why we even study humans, specifically trying to make this relevant for natural resource management. How to get started, so just give you an idea of where we're thinking. And then what would we study? What are questions natural resource managers would ask? So why should natural resource managers care about society? If we were in person right now, I would be throwing this out to you, and hopefully you'd be giving me a lot of good ideas. Since we can't do that, I will just start giving you some of my ideas here. And I'm going to be general about it, is that really anybody out there managing the environment should be aware that people care deeply about the environment. It is without good water and air, we could die, so it's our very survival depends on it. The products we use to survive, for lodging, for food, for everything, again, is something we need to survive. But it's also something that we move through our daily lives. We recreate in it. We move through it when we're going to work. We often work in natural environments. And so when decisions are made that might threaten the values that we have on this environment, people are going to come to you. And you don't want to be surprised. And so basically being ahead of the game and understanding society is going to make you a better prepared natural resource manager. So like I said, and you realize this, your actions often affect people's way of life. People will natural resource managers might get decisions on what will affect the water as water moves through their property, which then might move on to downstream properties, which might affect people's drinking water, fishing, the vegetation that grows in those areas. And so just even that one stream or river that you're working on will have downstream effects, but that goes for everything. Now, most natural resource managers that are out there often work directly with the public and are on public lands. And so again, a lot of those resources are going to be for timber use, for paper. They might be wildlife for hunting, for game management. And so those people depend on those things either directly or indirectly. So again, what you decide how those are going to be used, what the priorities are, and especially if you are a public lands manager, you basically need to listen to the public. And so that goes on to my next bullet, so I don't need to repeat that. And then finally, again, we live in a democracy. And so I'm talking to all you United States folks, but I'm hoping that most students, even if you're not from the US, are probably from a democracy. And the resources that managers are working through, even if they're private land managers, often are having to obey the rules, regulations of the country. And so that's because then the public has a say in what those are. So a lot of things like the Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act were actually passed because private industry was making bad decisions on the use of air and water. And so Congress and the legislature had to be involved to basically change that. We're not to the stage of saying federal laws need to be passed, but we are at a stage where we say if you better work with the public, you can manage your resources better for your goals as well as theirs. So again, let's just get away from natural resources for a minute. I'm not sure if you know who this guy is. If you can tell by the newspaper, it's either a guy named Dewey or Truman. And if you really don't know history well, you might think that's Dewey because, Dewey defeats Truman. Truman, it says right there in the paper. And that guy's happy. So clearly that's Dewey. Do you guys remember a President Dewey? Probably not, but you've probably heard of a President Truman, and that's him. And the Chicago Daily Tribune here got it wrong. They went off and did some polling during the election the night before, and their polls showed that Dewey was going to defeat Truman, and they wanted to be the first ones out there to basically say it. And it was wrong, and Truman was happy, and now this is a very famous picture we're using many years later, and the Chicago Tribune probably does not like that. So we don't want to be embarrassed. We don't want to predict what people are doing or thinking wrong. And especially, again, natural resource managers, you are going to be having to deal with society's values and what they think. Now, we can say this was back in the 50s, so, we have our methods much better now. But some of you, probably too young to remember this, but I remember it well, is the election of George W. Bush. There was a night, that time, they proclaimed we were going to have a president, Al Gore. He was proclaimed president by several media agencies, again, through exit polls from elections. They did social science research and got it wrong. Why did they get it wrong? Well, the margin of error was so slight. There was some weird things with the election. You might have heard about Florida, where people maybe thought they were voting one way and voted the wrong way because of the weird ballots. So the problem was the sample. They do sample sizes, and there's always error when you do a sample. And the margin of error between this was so small, especially in Florida, that the error got it wrong. And they were way too confident and tried to get word out. Again, this was 23 years ago. We're better, right? You probably remember this. Hillary Clinton was going to be president. It was pretty much confirmed. All the polls were pointing that way. And then Donald Trump basically came out of nowhere and won that election. And there's other reasons for that. Again, there was a lot of states, it was just a squeaker. But in some cases, their processes were a little bit more refined. They could see those little small margin of errors. But what they weren't thinking is people who hadn't voted before. And so Trump brought out people who hadn't voted before. And one of the big things they do is they always often ask people on these phone calls, have you voted before? And that's always a good indicator that they will vote in the next election. In this case, it wasn't. And then also they would say some people might have been embarrassed, or maybe they made a last minute decision thinking, there's no way I'm going to vote for Trump. And I can't really admit I'm going to vote for Trump. And they said, really, I need change. And they saw Trump as a change. And so they changed it. So a lot of changes like that. Again, a close election, and the way we ask questions might not have been the best way to get to the most reliable results. All right. So let's get back to natural resources. Really, everybody uses good social science, no matter who you are. It's if we're dealing with customers or stakeholders, we need to know what they're thinking. And so to identify media sources, like where do people get their information, is something we might use just for polling. We might also do focus groups. Someday I want to be in this focus group. I know that almost all big movies go off to focus groups first, and they gauge the audience. And sometimes the audience can totally change the ending of a movie based on what they prefer. I would love to be in that audience. I love movies, and I want to go off and change the next Star Wars movie when they're doing it. So everybody does it, not just us, not just natural resource people. But let's talk, again, what we need to think about to actually make this work. Who is going to do it? So in terms of natural resource managers, you might be doing it within your own organization. And you might even have researchers on staff who are specialized in it. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has an entire social science group that basically was working to study people. And they got PhDs. I think they have at least 1 or 2 PhDs on staff, as well as other folks with master's degrees that got their degrees in social science research. So that's the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. They're actually pretty elite in Florida. A lot of agencies don't even have any researchers on staff, but FWC has a bunch. U.S. Forest Service has research stations throughout the country, and in many of those research stations, there's social science researchers on staff. And then what's even interesting is you often don't see researchers at the local level, city and county. But Boulder City out in Colorado, they have a team of maybe 7 or 8 social scientists that are constantly working on improving recreation in that area by understanding their visitors. I've never seen that. They have a budget bigger than most agencies in total just to do that stuff. But recreation in Boulder, Colorado is very important. Now, often you can go outside your agency if you don't have people on staff or they're not able to do for you. You can work with universities or consultants, and maybe sometimes people have specific expertise. So for example, the FWC is contracted with me because I specialize in recreation, and their researchers on staff might not have that expertise, so they come to me to help do that. So you would then send money to an outside group to help do that, but you would then work with them through the contracting and through the process to make sure they're doing what you need, answering the questions that you believe are important. You need to understand the costs. While we're trained heavily in ecological and biological research as forestry and natural resource students, and you see the equipment and all that stuff, it's equally expensive to do social science research. Trying to get people to answer your questions and doing it in the right way takes a lot of effort and time. You don't need a lot of equipment. Sometimes you do. We actually have used drones before in my research. I use tablets all the time. But sometimes it can just be emails and email polling and things like that. But you've probably all turned down surveys in your life. So how do we got to put forth the effort to ensure people will complete our surveys. We also need to get permission. When you're doing research that has to do with people and you're maybe asking them sensitive questions, you want to make sure everybody is on board. So you need to make sure your supervisors are okay with what you're doing. Overall, the organizations you're working with, either directly who you're working for or maybe partnering with. And then at universities, we actually have an institutional review board and a human subjects committee. So anytime any researcher at the University of Florida, and I would say any major university in the country, has to get it approved through what we call IRB, the Institutional Review Board. They're very sensitive because there's been bad research out there that actually mistreated their subjects. They'd work on kids and things, or medical research. Now I don't. I'm usually just doing visitors out in natural areas, and people often will brush by me and not do the research. But still, they look at what I do and approve it. So most important things to know before surveying. Know your question. And I say this is really hard. You might think it's obvious, but I will have PhD students who've gone through 4 years of their research and they still don't quite know what they're asking. So you really need to know what your question is. If you don't, you're going to waste people's time, you'll ask questions that won't be helpful, and you might not use the correct tools. But asking the question is hard. You want to make sure you ask questions where you don't know the answers to it. And often you kind of suspect the answers, so asking questions that get you to where you want to go is probably one of the hardest parts of doing social science research. And then know your population, who you are trying to understand. Are you trying to understand all visitors in your area, or maybe just a subset of visitors? So you're trying to understand a community, a specific community that's close to your natural area, or is it the county or the state? And then how do you get to them? Those are all pretty hard questions, and the bigger you go, often the more expensive you go. And by understanding your population, that starts defining who your sample is and what your sampling framework is going to be. So important specific questions for natural resource managers, I've kind of put them into categories here. Understanding how people use natural resources. Often utilitarian, we can directly ask them, especially hunting is kind of interesting, even though that's FWC and other game management agencies out there can kind of observe, and they require hunters and fisher people to basically do that. Same with wood, is kind of goes through a system. We kind of see the market out there, but still there's methods we can do, maybe sometimes secondary data to get utilitarian information. Appreciation is harder, so recreation, just appreciating aesthetics and spiritual values and things like that, that's where we have to use maybe a little bit more. We have to go to them and ask good questions. How do people value natural resources? This gets into economics in some cases. So example of this is willingness to pay for ecosystem services. And just getting people to tell us how much they're willing to pay for clean water, that actually is very difficult. That is a series of questions that not only have to be asked well, but then you also need to ask them in a way that people understand them and answer them reliably. And then again, will answer them, don't just brush it off. How do people understand natural resources? So often when we want to do an environmental interpretation or environmental education, or basically even have a public meeting where we might going in to talk about fire management, we might want to know at what level are the public, the people that we're working with, what do they understand? So for example, for fire management, if you're going into a public meeting and you think, that smoky bear has basically ruined society and they all just think fire is bad. But actually what research has shown is that a lot of Floridians know the role of fire in their environment. They just don't want the smoke going through their communities. And so if you come in all ready for an anti-Smokey Bear meeting, and then they throw at you, well, we don't want smoke, and you're like, well, yeah, that might happen, they're going to totally catch you off guard. So anyway, understanding what people know and their perspective. And then I could just go on forever on this question. There's a lot there. How to do social science. I'm not going to get too much into it in this presentation, but it has a lot of different techniques and strategies. A lot of us think go right to the questionnaires, but that's just one of many things. Like I said, I've used drones in my research. Also, don't think that just because you're human, you can do social science research. Actually, you're a human who has bias. And so you might unconsciously be asking biased questions. I've had a lot of phone surveys where I could really tell where the people were going in the questionnaire. I could tell their bias and what they wanted me to answer. And like I said, PhD dissertations, sometimes there'll be a PhD dissertation just to try to figure out how to best measure attitudes. There's a attitude scale out there called the New Environmental Paradigm, and that was done by several researchers that ask a series of about 15 questions to see if people disagree or agree, to try to gauge where people fit on their environmental perspectives. And that's been through a ton of research on just 15 questions. And then often using existing strategies and measurements whenever possible. We often do not want to even invent questions. I tend to go off and use questions that have been asked in published research that have been valid and reliable, and then I adapt them for what I want to do. So it's like you don't want to go invent a DBH tape every time you want to go measure vegetation, you know? You use existing tools. Basically, social science questions, often we want to use existing questions. All right, so just to wrap this up, there's focus groups, there's individual interviews, and then even just observation and counting people. That's a diagram there at the bottom of counting visitors. Is just things that we can just do to better understand people out there and how they use and think about our resources. All right, so that's why, and a little bit of how on social science research. The next thing you need to understand is how to do it. Thank you.